You can't really make reparations for something as monumentally horrific as slavery.
I think anger is natural, and we connect on our collective anger a lot of the time.
What did poetry do for you?
It's just rap, you know? My name's George Mpanga, but you can call me George the Poet. Something happens over that Mediterranean. You go from being someone's child to an immigrant alien. I'm a London-based spoken word artist with roots in Uganda.
I'm Priyamvada Gopal. When I first started at Cambridge, there were no black faces in my classroom. I'm a literary historian and cultural commentator. I was born in India. I live and work in the United Kingdom.
I was intrigued because how often do you get to share ideas, solve problems, and have a conversation with someone who knows so much about resistance and colonial power?
So what could I personally hate a complexion for?
I was curious. He comes from a different background. He has different experiences. But I think our roads will cross, like our stories and our identities.
Come on, let's get into it. So Priya, recently we've seen a lot of Western universities reflecting on their possible involvement or heritage linked to the transatlantic slave trade. Your institution, Cambridge University, obviously the same university that I attended.
Yeah.
I read some interesting tweets from you regarding the university's announcement about investigating its own links to slavery. Can you
I raised a few questions. One was that it was presented as exploring if Cambridge and whether and in what ways Cambridge had benefited from the slave trade. The point is that there is no major institution in Britain, whether it's banks or financial houses or markets, that have not benefited from the immense wealth creation that slavery led to. So it's not a question of if, but in what ways. The point is that slavery led to benefits across societies, and they were networked benefits, right? So if you had railways that were built in part on slave wealth generated from slavery, and those railways came to your town, you benefited from slavery. If your students, and Cambridge catered, for instance, to elite young men, came from landed wealth, people who had plantations in Antigua or Jamaica, and they were paying fees to you, you benefited from slavery. So I think we have to understand that it's a very complex picture of benefits. And also, one other thing, you can't really make reparations for something as monumentally horrific as slavery. You can't actually bring back the generations who died and were maimed and lived as chattel. What you can do is to acknowledge that it has led to the impoverishment of subsequent generations, and that you can make some acknowledgement in a financial form of the damage that was done. You can't actually pay back what was taken.
This is one of the biggest frustrations around this. We often see reparations being laughed out of the discussion, whether on a political front, educational, economic, otherwise. How do you build up that aggregate energy or the momentum to tie all these conversations together?
I think there are complex conversations to be had, certainly about who gets reparations and in what form those reparations are paid out. The lead taken by some Caribbean countries to say, actually, you need to acknowledge that the poverty and the immiseration that we have inherited can be traced back through the centuries of empire and slavery. We need to make the connections repeatedly between the present and the past and the ways in which the past lives on in the present to generate that energy, I think.
Couldn't agree more.
So slavery has had consequences, obviously, for the Caribbean countries and for parts of Africa. But it also has an afterlife in Black British communities. What do you think the kind of modern consequences for immigrant communities in Britain, for second generation, third generation Black British young people is today?
I think the legacy is twofold. So on the one hand, you have the deep sense of displacement, statelessness, especially being second generation in a country that your parents may not have been received well in. Yeah. There's that displacement, there's that sense of not quite belonging and not really having a measure of where your story starts and what direction you should be aspiring to progress in.
Yeah.
That's one half of the tragedy. The other half is the miseducation of the masses on this side. A lot of people are not literate in that history, and it creates a tension. This conversation is non-existent in some of the places that it needs to happen most.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, on the one hand, there's miseducation, as in the educational system is not acknowledging the force of things like slavery and imperialism. Yeah, I mean, there's not very much teaching. My students don't come with much knowledge of it. Do you think that the memory of these historical processes is dying out in communities as well?
So this is hard to gauge.
Yeah.
But what I sense, the older I get, and the uglier the conversation around xenophobia in this country turns, what I sense is that there is a lot of pride around empire, around imperial exploits, around the colonial project. There's a sense of the white man's burden still having some legitimacy and winning gains in terms of spreading knowledge and technology and so on and so forth. That has gone unaddressed and unpacked for a long time. So it becomes further entrenched when it's passed down from generation to generation.
Do you think young Black British young people, Asian young people, do they have any understanding of the ways in which their lives are shaped by the heritage of slavery and empire?
Yeah, I think the Caribbean community, the Windrush generation of the 50s and 60s, did a very good job in inculcating some sort of cultural understanding. The Saturday schools that the West Indian community was very successful in setting up throughout the 80s. But as we know, economic pressures and social attacks on different fronts really made it hard for the Caribbean community to maintain that sense of education. So I see that that's disintegrated a little when it comes to my generation, and it makes it hard. But there is some awareness. What I find tragic is, especially when you look at young people that are now third and fourth generation, becoming further and further distant from that information that will give them some sort of sense of where they're coming from. What you're left with is a shame, which I grappled with for a long time, and I still do. This feeling of having to explain why we are in the situation that we are in.
Absolutely.
And on a personal level, feeling that you're doubly or more responsible in representing, you know, the potential of your people, or correcting the mistakes that are attributed to your people.
So in a sense, we have to become custodians of these other histories.
Right.
Communities have to grab them back.
Right.
And remember.
For the immigrant, there is no government that you are priority to.
Absolutely.
You know, you're not in the homeland. And over here, you have a government that is, you know, for the majority, that is reacting to your presence, but is not versed in who you are, has no record of your achievement, of your family. So you really need to take some initiative in protecting and honouring your story. As
you said, immigrant communities are not particularly anybody's priority, but there is the language of diversity and inclusivity whereby we're allowed a place at the table. So a handful of us are allowed to teach at elite universities or be part of elite institutions. I know that you've done some work with members of the British royal family, and there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that there is a non-white member now of the British royal family. So I just wondered whether you had thoughts about the, I guess, the controversial question of race and the royal family and the whole question of diversity. Can you diversify an institution like the royal family?
We're not seeing a diversifying project. We're seeing generational changes. So Prince Harry is the first person in his position of his time that, you know, represents the monarchy in the 21st century. And what his marriage to Meghan Markle represents is love, it's free choice.
Yeah.
It's a bit weird for me trying to square my, let's say, working class black British sensibilities with my Ugandan heritage, because the monarchy is very important to my parents, to my kingdom. So we understand the idea of a shared heritage or a shared identity in what that, you know, that family as a symbol. I may not necessarily have grown up, you know, in the folds of that passion, being out here, but I respect it. I do. I know what it means to people, and I love people. But it is a multifaceted question. I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Certainly to somebody of Indian descent, the empire was tied up with the fact of Victoria being Empress of India. And the British royal family is another British institution which will have benefited from both slavery and empire.
Yes, it is.
So there is a question of, for instance, when we know that famous black poets have refused the honor of the OBE, the Order of the British Empire. We know that other black achievers have accepted it, but it's not uncontroversial. What does it mean for people who descend from formerly colonized peoples to carry the empire as an initial after their name? So there is that whole question of what should our relationship to the institution be? Should we accept, you know, the Order of the British Empire?
It's so complicated for me.
Yeah.
For me specifically, coming from a family that is very close with the Ugandan monarchy. So my grandfather was the first Attorney General of our kingdom and went into exile with the king over here. We know that the brand of colonialism that the British practiced in Africa was one of befriending the chieftains and the leaders of the region and reaping the benefits of the land within the context of that relationship. But at the same time, it means a lot to a lot of people to have these affiliations and connections. And I suppose that there is a question for individuals that hail from minority ethnic backgrounds, especially those that were under colonial rule, a question of strategy, long term. What do you want? Do you want a degree of assimilation? Do you want a foothold in this country? Do you want to continue to build on the trauma of the past? Or are we just saying we're ripping up the status quo and we're currently figuring out? Because most of us don't actually have that game plan. In your book, Insurgent Empire, you talk about resistance to colonialism, how that played out in different contexts, right? What do you believe is the legacy of that resistance?
The book sets out to do two things in relation to the story. The first is to puncture the mainstream British mythology that when freedom from slavery and from empire came along, it was because it was gifted by Britain to the enslaved and the colonized. So it sets out to question that, and it points out that slaves rebelled all the time. Okay, so it's really important to put that back in the narrative. But the second aspect of the book is just as important, that the resistance of slaves was heard back in Britain, and it helped create a tradition of criticizing slavery and empire back in Britain. We often think of abolition as just some very nice white guys who decided that it was a very bad thing and we're going to, you know, free the slaves. But actually, if you look at the written works left behind by abolitionists, many of them are really aware that the plantations are in ferment, that slaves are rebelling, that the colonized are rebelling, the indentured are rebelling. And so what I'm saying is that we need to recover the stories of resistance, not just the stories of empire and enslavement, both in other parts of the world, but also from within Britain. There's a minority dissident tradition in Britain which says, not in our name. You can't enslave and colonize people in our name. And that story has been completely marginalized by mainstream history. And so part of the conversation about bringing back other stories, I think these histories have to be recovered. And young white Britons have to be reminded that their ancestors weren't only just colonists and enslavers, but that they also resisted and questioned their government and those who claim to represent them. But it strikes me that there might be questions our audience wishes to ask of us, so perhaps we should turn to them now.
Please.
My question is about decolonizing the university and whether or not you think that it'll be effective, not just making voices heard that do not conform to the norms of academic speak, but also in considering them as valid forms of the production of knowledge.
It's not just about diversifying or bringing in a range of voices. That is important in its own right. But I always explain to my students that decolonization is about understanding what we know, why we know, and also what we don't know. And also recognizing that the knowledge traditions, which are being claimed as European, are not only European. They have often drawn on the traditions of Africa, Asia, and beyond. So we need to understand that the knowledges which are now presented as being kind of great European thought have multiple lines drawing on other parts of the world, and that these histories also need to be restored to their place of honor. I mean, decolonization is often presented as, oh, this is against, white people. It's not. It's about saying that the world is diverse and knowledge has been produced across different parts of the globe. We need to honor the fact that Europe often drew on other traditions in order to produce its knowledge.
My question is, do you think that there is an ascendant orthodoxy on the political left that is weaponizing identity politics to breed competitive victimhood and tribalism in a way that undermines Martin Luther King's dream that we would be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin or whatever strand of identity one gives primacy to? Thank you.
Great question. I think it's happening on both sides. I think it's happening on the left and the right, and to characterize it as either is playing into it. We see that these kind of identity politics play up in times of economic downturn or, in tandem with cycles of big changes, as we're seeing in Western Europe and other parts of the world. When the political rhetoric becomes increasingly polarized and divisive, I see it as a dialectic and something that dialogue, respectful dialogue, contact, people being in close proximity with one another can begin to address and break down.
It's something of a false narrative. Everybody has an identity. Everybody is political in one sense or the other. So identity politics is with us. The difference is whether it is recognized as identity politics or whether it is not. So the white majority has an identity and it has a politics. So it is often women or black people who are accused of having an identity politics. But in fact, in an institution like Cambridge, it's full of white identity politics. It's all over the place. I can't walk 5 minutes without coming up, bam, against an assertion of aggressive whiteness. The interesting thing about victimhood today, who is claiming victimhood? It's largely white elite men. They're claiming persecution. They're claiming their Trump Trump, a multimillionaire, claims he represents victims. You know, and there's a range of commentators in Britain constantly claiming they're being persecuted by people of color and aggressive, woke black and brown women. This is a nonsensical narrative, and I think that we should say this narrative is flawed. It does not represent reality. And we need to have an honest conversation that isn't determined by this sort of mythology of oppressed white men suffering at the hands of identity politics.
We've talked about how the remnants of slavery and colonialism have evidently left us with a system that is, you know, stacked against us. But I would like to know whether you think that change is better affected by sort of working within the system, working our way up that way, or being kind of more of an outside disruptive force. What's really the way forward for young people?
Essential to fighting the good fight is accepting that the change you want to see might not happen in your lifetime. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's something that I am definitely grappling with, not just on the Western front, being out here in the diaspora, but also when I return to the homeland. The first thing I have to accept is that it's not just about me feeling happy with my sphere of existence. You've got to really apply yourself to a long-term strategy, a long-term understanding of the challenges. Secondly, on an individual level, I think it's really important for us all to take responsibility of ourselves, of our personal sense of awareness, who you are, who I am. This is the journey that I've been on through poetry. At one point, I was a Cambridge student. Before that, I was one of the few black boys in a grammar school. After that, I went straight into the music industry. All of this stuff really disoriented me. And it's only through taking time and articulating myself and giving myself my whole 20s to come to terms with who I am that I was able to pinpoint my contribution and land on exactly what I can stomach and exactly what I am able to do. I can stomach working with the royal family. Some people couldn't. And it shouldn't be expected of me to, want to bring everyone to the same fight that I might be fighting.
One thing I want to add to that, it's true that change happens on many fronts, and we each position ourselves differently in relation to change. And I think that change does happen if all of us work to enact change. But equally, we also have to be aware that sometimes it is presented to us as something that only people from above can do. I think part of reclaiming our personal agency is to be able to say, no, everybody can effect change. And you do not have to be a member of the royal family or a Cambridge Don, as in my case, to be able to make effective interventions. But I think wherever we are, we can choose to keep a critical perspective. I think that is absolutely essential. We could be part of any institution, but to say, I'm not going to inhabit it fully, I'm not going to buy its stories as self-evident truths. I'm going to sit on the margins and examine things in all their reality and in all their honesty. You know what? I actually know what it's like to be white, because in my country, I'm a white woman.
I'm bored. Like, I want to talk about a visa to Mars. I don't want to talk about racism.
Can you recite a poem for us?
I'm a poet, so yeah, I can.
The British royal family is another British institution which will have benefited from both slavery and empire.
For the immigrant, there is no government that you are priority to.
The interesting thing about victimhood today, who is claiming victimhood? It's largely white elite men. Can you tell us a little bit about your own journey from where you grew up to Cambridge, which is a very distinctive kind of place and often involves a degree of culture shock. Can you say a little bit more about what that has entailed?
Yeah, so it only occurred to me later in life that I only grew up around black people. my estate to this day is 46% black, African. And at the time it was predominantly Caribbean. So what that afforded me was a very strong sense of self. I was, within the Caribbean community, but part of an African family that had a very strong sense of cultural identity. So at so many points in my life, I had to affirm and reaffirm who I was, take pride in my point of difference, and celebrate that. So by the time I got to a grammar school, it was shaken a little bit. It was shaken a little bit when I learned what black and estate meant to other people. I never knew that. I had all these middle-class, white and Indian and Chinese kids asking me about, what's it like on the estate? Is it dangerous? Is it exciting?
You've spoken a little bit elsewhere about your going to the grammar school, appreciating the discipline that it gave you, but also being troubled by what you saw as the enforcement of white norms.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I'm very grateful for the school that I went to, but I definitely got the message that a sensible gentleman, a credible person, is X, and X doesn't do that, doesn't sound like that, doesn't talk like that, doesn't walk or dress like that. And that really, really disturbed me for a long time because I really absorbed that narrative, man. And it's not until I really came into my own as a poet in Cambridge, having to articulate my experience with my own words, our dialect, our colloquialisms, to audiences that are not part of our world, that I really started to accept it. But even after graduating and presenting myself to the world and starting to do TV and news appearances, I still have these rules in my mind.
Yeah.
Don't embarrass your parents. Don't talk how you talk with your friends, because how you talk with your friends is clearly criminal, And it takes a while before you realize all the ways in which this feeds into the harassment and misunderstanding, criminalization, hyper-masculinization of young black men in particular.
What did poetry do for you?
Again, and this is an explanation that I've not often, but in my early years, I'd kind of swerved this explanation, but it's rap. It's just rap. Yeah, because I was like, all these poetic techniques and devices that we're studying in the curriculum are done to a much higher standard in rap. Right? So that emboldened me. Yeah, definitely. So Priya, when we've spoken, you've referenced your own upbringing and how that gave you a privileged outlook in many respects. How do you make sense of that now?
I've had an upbringing that was partly subcontinental and partly in the West. And in India, although I'm a woman, I belong to an upper caste. I belong to a community that, in a way, like white Britons, does not see its own privileges, does not see its own advantages, and very frequently likes to think of itself as the victim because other people are making demands. So Dalits, the lower castes, non-traditional dominant communities are making demands. When I'm in the West, as a woman of color against a white majority society, I can see it the other way around, that I can see how white privilege works. I have a certain double consciousness around this, which is I know what it's like to be part of a vulnerable minority. I also know what it's like to be part of a privileged majority that A, doesn't understand its privileges, B, feels like a victim when challenged on those privileges. So in a funny way, I actually see how whiteness operates. I sometimes tell white men who are a bit threatened that, you know what, I actually know what it's like to be white, because in my country, I'm a white woman. In my country, I'm a white woman. And I've been through that process where I've only thought about gender and not thought about my caste privilege in the way that we are familiar with women here talking about gender but not talking about their racial privilege. So I think the overall consequence is to understand that none of us are necessarily only victims or only oppressors. I think that part of our exploration of colonialism and decolonization has to also involve understanding our role in it. Yeah. What is the heritage we come from? What did our ancestors do in relation to the imperial project? Who were they? Decolonization isn't about saying, oh, well, all white people are terrible and all people of color are great. It's never been about that ridiculous narrative that is often propagated as the victim narrative. It's about saying we were all influenced by this huge historical process that unfolded over several centuries. I always begin my lectures to students in the beginning of term saying, I am here because of colonialism. Colonialism picked a group of elite Indians to be taught English and to be made English in every way but blood and color. And I am the descendant of the people who were treated as privileged intermediaries between the colonial government and the millions whom we govern. So for me to say that I'm here because I'm great and I just did the hard work and I got here, I mean, that's a nonsensical narrative. I teach today at Cambridge partly because of inherited privilege. So to what extent do you think you've been able to change narratives, or to what extent is your work aimed at changing narratives that we don't often question?
So I think this goes back to an earlier point that we discussed about custodianship of our story being our responsibility. I think through poetry, even just the move from rap to poetry, I've been able to say to guys, that the rules that we just took for granted, that you as a young black man, if you're not the hardest and you're not the most chauvinistic, then it's harder to notice you. You're less valid. Yeah. Those rules are completely redundant if you say they are. It gives people license to decide exactly who they want to be, and that I'm able to impute that simply by cherry picking the aspects of my environment that I want, that I want to absorb. But if there's a self-destructive oppositional force that comes along with it, that is kind of like taken for granted, because at 17 years old, my biggest fear was another 17-year-old black boy. I don't like that one. Someone else can take that. It's not for me. That kind of thinking, it needs to be scaled. And it's very hard when we don't have custodianship of our own story to ensure that all of our young people are getting that messaging.
What sort of stories do you think would actually help make for change at manifest levels? Like what kinds of things that do you think people don't think about that they should be thinking about?
So a few years ago, I went to the TED conference in Vancouver. Yeah. And these guys were talking, this was the big argument, the ethics of basically a visa system for Mars. This was 2015, they're talking about interplanetary exploration, new laser treatment for HIV. That's what's missing. That's what's missing in communities like mine. An awareness of more than racism. For a lot of young black people, what is wrong with our situation is kind of delegated to us as our business. You must spend the next 20 years fighting the ills of this society. However, if you really were invited to these conversations about Mars, if you felt a stake in cutting edge laser treatment to revolutionize the battle against HIV, if you really felt some ownership in that, you would be running in that direction. And I see that with a lot of much poorer young people on the African continent.
So, I mean, are you suggesting that what you describe as kind of self-destructiveness is connected to not thinking about where else you could go, but kind of focusing on the ills that you suffer?
Statelessness. We don't belong to anything. That's why a lot of our young people can take the lives of another person. Like, who am I? Where am I falling from? What's the big anchor that I need to break out of in order to, you know, become more?
You've written about anger as a young man yourself.
Yeah.
You're still young, but as a teenager, do you think anger is an unproductive, that is self-destructive force, or do you think it can have consequences that are beneficial?
I think anger is natural. And nature doesn't do productive, unproductive. Nature is nature. Now, in my life, that anger has been helpful. I've been able to...
In what ways?
I've been able to channel it to articulate my stance, to just figure out exactly what I want to be in the world, why I want to be these things. A lot of the unanswered questions about who I am and why my environment is the way it is drove me to become a sociologist. And that empowered me to be able to feed back into my community. And we connect on our collective anger a lot of the time. I don't know what your experience with that has been.
I would say all the thinkers who have theorized resistance and change and rebellion at some level have been driven by indignation, by a sense that injustices have been committed and the world has to be set to rights. So I completely concur that anger can have, it can manifestly have sort of destructive consequences if it's not thought about and not channelized towards thinking through facts. So, you know, currently we have certain forms of majority rage in many contexts, not just in Britain, in contexts across the world. But that rage, I think, is different from righteous indignation. You can be angry and you can blame any number of people you want for your situation. That doesn't mean it's factually correct. But legitimately harnessed indignation, which studies the situation and understands what injustices are and thinks about it carefully, that can be a very productive kind of emotion. But random rage at having your privileges snatched away, I think that's one of the dangers that we're looking at in the present day.
That's interesting. So you're saying the ability to articulate exactly where your anger comes from is what legitimates the anger?
Well, I think to understand what it is you're upset about and who and what is rationally responsible for it. So in a situation where you're upset about austerity, it doesn't make sense to blame immigrants. It is your government and it is the rich of this country who have inflicted austerity and poverty on you. So this is to say that anger makes sense if you can wield it with precision and wield it with care. Simply lashing out at the nearest vulnerable object in rage, that's not a good thing.
Does it not become a double-edged sword when we get to really, you know, the age of the demagogue and people that are able to put together a narrative that holds true in the minds of a lot of their audience?
It is extremely worrying. In my own country, we now have the rise of majority Hindu nationalism, which absolutely feeds off the rage of people and invites them to think about Muslims as their main enemy. And in fact, it has been immensely successful and it is immensely dangerous. And I worry tremendously about a nation that is still fairly young. It's about 70 odd years old, which began as a kind of dream of inclusivity and secularism and multiple religions flourishing, now turned into singular rage against minority groups. And I think that's deeply dangerous.
I think we might have some more audience questions, actually. So,
many of us in this room have benefited, are beneficiaries of the legacy of the British Empire. What I'd like to ask you is, should we take responsibility for its wrongdoings of the past? And what do you think are the best ways that we can atone for its sins in the modern day?
The first thing I want to say is that I personally don't use the language of atonement and repentance. I think if people want to atone, that's a private act between them and their God or their church. The language of responsibility is slightly different. Colonialism didn't end all that long ago. For many African countries, they ended in the 1980s. So, it's within a lot of people's living memories. And the continent of Africa and much of Asia struggles with those legacies. So what we have to do is to say, what are the manifest ways in which populations, peoples, communities within this country have been damaged by the legacies of slavery and colonialism? And what are the ways in which we can start to enact structural changes which address the disenfranchisement and the injustice? We cannot have an attitude to the past where we say, well, we're really proud about, the Second World War and the British victory in the Second World War, but colonialism, that was in the past. I think that that particular false opposition has to be questioned.
My question is more how the ingenuity in the workplace leads us to kind of be unable to find our own identity. How do you think we'll be able to overcome that in regards to not being able to be our genuine selves at work, and if anything will ever be done about it?
I think going back to the idea of statelessness and us not necessarily feeling like we have a space, different communities, different ethnic minority communities have different coping strategies for that kind of dynamic. Often my Asian friends were quite happy to doctor their names or their appearances in order to just, move on. Now, in our world, as a black person, it's a taboo. It's like, nah, don't start playing with your name. That's a disrespect to your ancestors. However, I also became aware that not everyone takes it that personally. And I think oftentimes that community and the family back there. So something like doctoring your name for the school is just business. It's just a transaction. Don't take it that personally. However, I feel like when it comes to us, or me in particular, with that sense of statelessness, I find it a lot harder to make those kinds of decisions. And the solution that I've created over time is just to make my own space where I only account for myself. And that happens through enterprise, but before the enterprise aspect, it had to happen personally. I had to be in Cambridge and be able to just be exactly what I am. So until you reach that sense of absolution, there will always be that tension on the front of the workplace or wherever else you have to deal with this.
Hi, I always come across this term, I don't see color. I think there's color blindness, especially when I have conversations about identity and politics with second or third generation immigrants. And they say, oh, if I recognize race and this structural racism, I'm perpetuating this thinking. But obviously we see color. And from my observations, most of the people who bring up this term are relatively well off, or they win the game already. So in my understanding, for these game winner, they are supposed to have more social and cultural capital to be the game changer. But why would they have this kind of thinking? And what are your advice to talk to these kind of people?
There are penalties for talking about race. My first 15 years at Cambridge, I never used the word race or whiteness or anything. It was very clear that the norms enforced the fact that anybody who discussed race was a troublemaker. So second and third generation people who want to be successful, and you say they're fairly well off, let's face it, they understand the price to be paid for being incorporated into the mainstream of this society. And one of the things that you're required to do several things, but one is play the game that there's no color and nobody sees color, and therefore there is no racism, right? You have to collude in that mythology. Secondly, you're invited to perpetuate the mythologies of the mainstream society. So you not only agree to play along, you also act as its mouthpiece. There's a problem with identity politics, there's a problem with people claiming victimhood, there's a problem with snowflakes, there's a problem with, no platforming. So I think we need to think about the terms of engagement that people of color are required to use in order to be successful. And I think that in a sense, you answered your own question.
There is also the very real experience of a lot of people of colour who feel put upon, feel burdened by this constant conversation of race. Like I said, we're told at a young age that that's our business. That's what you get to deal with. That's where you get to be an expert. Anytime you see a young black person on the news, bet they're going to be talking about race, right? And I personally can identify with a frustration with that cycle. For example, last year, I had an incident with the police. I was sitting in my car, the engine was off. I was outside my parents' house. They searched me for weapons. Now, that is classic racial discrimination. But one phrase that I kept repeating, because the thing was recorded and a lot of people saw it, and some people took issue with this particular phrase, I kept saying, I don't have time for this. And that's the frustration of a black man that's been dealing with this all his life. I'm bored. Like, I want to talk about a visa to Mars. I don't want to talk about racism. So I agree with Priya, there is a degree of game playing among a lot of us, but there is also a degree of exasperation and frustration because we're not given the tools to have these conversations in a constructive way. To extend that story, I was on BBC Question Time later on that year, and I was thrown a question about immigration. I mentioned the word xenophobia, and it really upset a lot of people. So we often find that there's a circular element to conversations about race that puts us off talking about it or seeing it in general. And sometimes that you have to read the situation and give people that respectful distance.
This is a question for George, actually. You and Priya have discussed on issues on racism and prejudice, but it would be nice to hear your views as a poet, George. So can you recite a poem for us?
I'm a poet, so yeah, I can. Okay. The defining characteristic of a hate crime, it's not actually hate, it's prejudice. We use the word hate to define it because the prejudice is born of a hateful climate. But a climate is a collective mood. It's not an individual selective move. Now, in the face of political ineptitude, we only have one option. Let's improve. Hate is such a strong word for such a weak emotion. A wound can't heal if hatred keeps it open. And not all wounds can be physically revealed, but they do all deserve the ability to heal. Thank you.
That was great, George. Let's do this again.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
Who would have thought that in our rich country, we use hunger as a weapon?
It's much more difficult to be left-wing than to be right-wing, you know, because the history of the left is full of lies and betrayals. When people say I'm right-wing, they are really right-wing.
Yeah, that's Art has to be subversive. If you don't have a level of anger about you, then stay at home, you know.